Honourable member for Nanaimo, Cowanston in the Islands.
Mr. Speaker, that's the longest 2 minutes I think I can possibly recollect. Honourable member said he wanted 2 minutes over time. For a member who has complained about the members of the New Democratic Party stalling and taking up time, he's the only member who's taken part in the debate who went overtime on second reading, overtime on third reading, and monopolized a good deal of the discussion in committee. Nevertheless, I commend him for his interest and for the work which he has done. But I think he'd be better advised to worry about the position of his own party instead of worrying about the position of the New Democratic Party. We're quite able to take care of ourselves, and he'd better square with the member for Hamilton West and the member for St. John's West and some of the other members who have raised very valid concerns about this legislation, and concerns which haven't yet been resolved.
They're going to vote for it.
That's right, they're going to vote for it. And that's exactly what the member of the Yukon's going to do. His speech was in two parts. Before dinner, he spent all his time saying what a great piece of legislation this was, what hypocrites the New Democratic Party were because they weren't going to vote for it, and then spent all his time since dinner analyzing the bill and taking it to pieces and damning the government for the way in which they handle the situation. Now that's a typical Tory approach.
Best of both worlds, he said.
You can send out the speech to two different classes of people. So for those who are in favor of the bill, you send them one half the speech, and those who are against it, you send the other half.
I wonder what he had for dinner.
Broke at dinner was perfect.
What did he have for dinner, Tony?
That barbecue pork.
Mr. Speaker,
Seen with breakfast time.
this bill, C-25, is a very difficult bill to assess. And the reason is obvious. In the first place, there is no difference of opinion between the various political parties as to the advisability of making a land bridge available to the United States to transport gas from Prudhoe Bay to the United States. This party were advocating considering this proposal a year ago. And when the National Energy Board brought down its report in August, the leader of this party, the member for Oshawa Whitby, set forth the conditions under which we would support legislation to have this line constructed. So that there's no difference on that point of view. Why we voted against the bill on second reading, and why we're going to vote against it on third reading, is because our concerns have not been resolved. And I say to the member for Yukon, he didn't worry about Premier Blakeney or anyone in the West telling us what we're going to do. We make our own decisions, and I don't think it comes with good grace from him or anyone else to suggest that our decision with reference to this piece of legislation or any other piece of legislation will be dictated by what we are told by someone outside of our own caucus. Now, our objections to this legislation lie basically in two areas. First, the agreement itself, which this legislation virtually ratifies. We think the agreement was ill-conceived, hastily considered, and that the government entered into an agreement which is not in the national interests of the people of Canada. Secondly, we are critical of this legislation not so much for what is in the bill now that has been amended, but for the things that are not in this bill. Member criticized me and said that he wanted to chastise me. I'd simply cringe at the thought of him chastising me. He wanted to chastise me because I hadn't moved any motions in the committee. Well, as a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, first of all, the Conservative members moved some good amendments, which I supported. The amendments which were proposed by the Council of Yukon Indians, which were proposed by the Committee for Arctic Research, and for the Committee for an Independent Canada, I asked the government and I asked the opposition members, official opposition members, if they were prepared to support those. They were turned down. There was no use at all in going through the charade of one member in that committee reading motions, which it was perfectly apparent that the government members and the official opposition were not going to support. I do want to say that the bill was greatly improved in committee. Many of the most obvious deficiencies in the legislation were remedied, and I commend the Deputy Prime Minister for accepting those changes. To have really made this bill effective would have required redrafting the bill. It would have required introducing amendments which no private member could introduce. I suppose we could now, at third reading, introduce a motion to refer this bill back, asking the government to negotiate with the United States to make certain changes in the agreement, to make fundamental changes in Bill C-25. That would simply be histrionics. No doubt about it. The government has been pushing this bill through as quickly as it can, I think too quickly for proper and careful consideration. There's no doubt that the official opposition is gung-ho to hurry this bill through, as the member for the Yukon has demonstrated again and again. But the fact remains
Drags his feet a bit.
that this House is about to take part in putting on the statute books of Canada a piece of legislation in which there are gaps and deficiencies that are glaring and will be apparently more glaring as this project proceeds. Let me just draw the House's attention, first of all, to the fact that we're passing this legislation despite the fact there's been no agreement with Foothills Yukon Limited, the company which was recommended by the National Energy Board to get a certificate of convenience and public convenience and public utility, whatever it is. They were recommended to be allowed to proceed with this project. Now, this agreement is being negotiated. We don't know what's going to be in the agreement. That agreement is important for a number of reasons. That agreement will set forth the hiring procedures. That agreement will set forth the timetable for proceeding with the project. That agreement, most important of all, will set forth the environmental impact protection provisions, which ought to be there. Now, I don't think enough consideration has been given to the problem of environmental protection in this measure. The member for Edmonton Strathcona this afternoon, in quoting from a brief from the Churches of Canada, made the comment that he thought the position they were taking really constituted a philosophy of no growth. I read that brief. I don't agree with him. I don't think that it envisages a no growth situation. What it does do is to remind Parliament and the government that it should be possible to have economic growth without destroying the environment, that it should be possible to improve the living standards of the people of this generation without destroying the capacity to live well for the next generation. Those two things are not mutually exclusive, surely. And I think that there's been a complete failure to understand the dangers that are implicit. And we might have been able to measure what protection the government had in mind if we had the agreement between the government of Canada and the Foothills Yukon Limited. We haven't got it. We had the Lissick inquiry, which took only 3 months. And the Lissick, Dean Lissick himself, at every hearing said, of course, this is only a preliminary inquiry. There's going to be a second inquiry. Of course, now we're told there isn't going to be a second inquiry. There's going to be one of the committees set up to look into environment. Of course, by that time, most of the plans will already be underway. This is a serious deficiency in the failure to have anything concrete in this legislation to say that while we want the pipeline, we don't want the environment of northern Canada destroyed or the livelihood of its people impaired. For instance, Mr. Speaker, the United States government hasn't yet set the price for the gas. And because it hasn't set the price for the gas, the Foothills Limited haven't been able to get any gas contracts. And because they haven't any gas contracts, they can't do any of their financing. Because no financial institution is going to buy bonds or debentures from a company on the basis of selling gas when it has no fixed firm contracts. So here we are with no knowledge at all as to what the price is going to be, whether or not there are gas contracts available, or going to be immediately available, or whether the financing is going to be completed. There's nothing, and it may be in the agreement, but there's certainly nothing in the legislation about cost overruns. In the message which President Carter sent to the American Congress, there was a deliberate stipulation that there would be stipulation that there would be no financial support coming from the government. This afternoon, the member for the Yukon said there'll be not $1 of taxpayers' money involved. How does he know that? Certainly I don't know it. I'm sure that the Deputy Prime Minister doesn't know it. Because there'll be another parliament here, there may be another government here, there'll be other members here. And if that pipeline is 3/4 completed and they can't get money to finish it, what government will dare to sit back and do nothing?
Paid the CPR.
The story of the CPR will be like a game of penny ante compared to what will be needed in the event that there are heavy cost overruns for this project. Of course they'll have to come back to Parliament. And when they come back to Parliament, there'll be people who are just as supine as the member for Alaska who will vote for Yukon, who will vote for it. Who will vote for it because they'll say, look, if we don't finish it, there won't be any jobs. And there won't be any gas. The second thing I draw to the attention of the House is that there is no agreement. Despite the fact we're passing this legislation, there's no agreement between the Government of Canada, the Territorial Council of the Yukon, or the provincial governments of British Columbia, Alberta, or Saskatchewan. No agreement at all. Now,
well, I'll go.
It's true that
continue to smell, but I won't. These
bodies will have to, particularly the provincial governments, will have to agree before an agreement is signed. But they're going to be under the same type of pressure that this House of Commons is under. They're going to be told there are over a million unemployed in Canada. If you want jobs, get an agreement. Don't hold this up. In the public eye, they're going to be accused of holding up a pipeline, which is essential to economic growth in this country, and they're going to sign. And yet what's involved? And the member for the Yukon says there's going to be no taxpayers' money. There could be a lot of local taxpayers' money because the construction of this pipeline, first of all in the Yukon, is going to put a heavy financial burden on the people of the territory. They're going to have to increase their infrastructure. They are going to have to supply improved educational services, health services, police services. And where's the money coming from? In the case of the Yukon, they're going to get an advance payment on their taxes. On which they're going to pay interest. And they are not going to get the $200 million heritage fund which was proposed. If I were the member for the Yukon, on that alone I'd vote against this legislation. If it isn't amended now, it won't be amended. Let's make no mistake about that.
You're not in your own seat.
If the member will just sit down and keep quiet for a while, the trouble is when he sits down, he agitates his mental processes, and this seems to get him, make him very vociferous. I ask him just to sit down. I listen very quietly to him, and I suggest that he just try to control his exuberance. And what about the provincial governments? British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan. This pipeline will go through areas which will affect their local government structure. It will increase the demand for housing, for police protection, for additional schools, hospitals. Who's going to meet that? We don't know. Now, it may be that the provincial governments and the federal government will reach satisfactory agreements as to compensation to those municipalities. But we've had no evidence of it. We had the municipalities from the region in Peace River, and they certainly hadn't received any assurance either from the government of British Columbia or from the federal government. And we're being asked to pass legislation, despite the fact that the provincial authorities, the Yukon Territorial Council, and the local governing bodies have no idea at all how they're going to meet the burdens which are being imposed upon them by this Parliament and by this legislation. Thirdly, there's no agreement which has yet been reached with the native people who will be affected by this pipeline. Now, negotiations started with the Yukon Council of Yukon Indians as far back as 1973. On the 14th of February this year, the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development said he hoped that we were making progress. But of course we hoped we'd make progress and have a settlement in principle last fall. Now we hope we may have it soon. But there's still no settlement. No settlement at all. And if we don't move any more quickly in the next 4 or 5 years as we moved in the last 4 or 5 years, there isn't going to be a settlement prior to the commencement of construction on this pipeline. Now, the Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources was quoted by the media a few months ago saying, you couldn't agree that there would be no commencement of construction until the pipeline had been reached, because that would allow the native people to hold the country up to blackmail. And the member for the Yukon reiterated that argument again this evening. You can't allow one small group of people to hold the nation up to ransom. And he went so far as to say that even if the whole of his area were against this legislation, he would support it because it's in the national interest. Mr. Speaker, on the other hand, surely any minority group in this country have a right to consideration. And what we are doing when we pass this legislation is putting the blackmail on the other foot. Because what we are saying by this legislation is that we're now going to build the pipeline, and we're saying to the native people, you either sign the agreement that we put in front of you, or the project's going to begin, and once the project is finished, the chances of getting a settlement are extremely remote. I'll come to the member's amendment in just a moment.
Well, it's after.
I think, of course, it's after the fact, and the other member knows that, but he wants to pretend he doesn't know it. Mr. Speaker, surely the members of this House who have listened to briefs presented by the native people, not only in northern Canada but in southern parts of Canada, know perfectly well that probably the blackest page in the history of this country is our treatment of the native people, whom we robbed of their land, whom we deceived, to whom we made promises that haven't been kept, who live today, most of them in direst poverty, stuck off in reservations. In some parts of the areas, not even having reservations, and no agreement, no treaty. Our forefathers may have been excused. I personally don't excuse them, but they may have been excused by virtue of the fact that they didn't realize the enormity of the crime that was being perpetrated. But, Mr. Speaker, we in this Parliament can't claim ignorance. We know what has happened, and we know what's going to happen again. If the government doesn't put its foot down and say we're going to get an agreement with the people, and the company has said repeatedly through its spokesman for the National Energy Board and before the special committee of this House that they don't want to begin the project unless they have the cooperation of native people. They've said they don't want to build a pipeline in a hostile environment. Of course they don't. There are too many things that could happen, too many difficulties that could occur. And I think that we will regret not having had something much more definitive in this legislation with respect to an agreement in principle with the native people regarding their land claims in the area affected by the pipeline. The fourth thing I want to refer to is the fact that, and this has been referred to many times, but I want to touch on it because it was mentioned again today by both the Deputy Prime Minister and the member for Yukon. Fourth thing I want to refer to is that there's no guarantee with reference to the Canadian content. No guarantee of the 100,000 man-years that the Deputy Prime Minister spoke of. Although actually if you take out the Dempster Spur, we're probably talking about 67 or 68,000. But that's a mere detail. The argument's been put up today that, particularly by the member for Yukon, who seemed to be even more vociferous in protection of the government than the Deputy Prime Minister was, that we didn't need to worry anymore about Canadian content because we had the assurance of the company and the assurance of the government that they wanted to have Canadian content. And the committee. Mr. Speaker, there isn't any doubt about that. That's true. When Mr. Blair, the president of Foothills Yukon Limited, was on the stand, I quoted to him from his own submissions to the National Energy Board, in which he said that they would buy all their pipe in Canada. And I asked him if he still stood by that. He said yes. And practically all of the compressors and the fittings and the valves. He said yes. And I believe him. And I believe the Deputy Prime Minister when he says he wants to see all the business done in Canada. That's not the point at issue. The point at issue is that we're ratifying an agreement with the United States, and Article 7 of that agreement has paramountcy. And it says, having regard to the objectives of this agreement, each government will endeavour to ensure that the supply of goods and services to the pipeline project will be on generally competitive terms. Elements to be taken into account in weighing competitiveness will include price, reliability, servicing capacity, and delivery schedules. That's crystal clear. The matter of competitiveness will not decide on the pious wishes of the Deputy Prime Minister or the good intentions of the President of Foothills. The allocation in the final analysis of a contract will lie with the terms that are set out in Article 9. And when the member for the Yukon argued, as he did this afternoon, that you didn't have to worry about this because the committee was going to be set up to which matters would be referred, and that they would see to it that Canadian content was taken care of. Mr. Speaker, could anything be more absurd? The member take a look at what the proposed change in the standing order says. I'll come round to my friend. Doesn't need to
Your
worry about
own
what I
seat, to be
supported.
honest,
He just try to control himself. I'll get round to what I said, position I took in committee. But the proposal which is made in the order paper, which is on the order paper for today, is one which certainly I support. I support insofar as the fact that it's better than having no committee at all to which the monitoring agency must give account. But it says, it's to be clause T, and it says Northern Pipelines to consist of not more than 15 members to which shall stand permanently referred all reports, orders, agreements, regulations, directions, and approvals mentioned in sections 12, 13, 14, 15, and 22 of the Northern Pipeline Act, provided the said committee shall report thereon at least 3 times in every session. Now, what power does that give the committee? This is a committee of report to which the monitoring agency will periodically give information as to how things are going. There's no guarantee that the reports it makes to Parliament will even be discussed. And certainly they will have no authority to discuss anything prior to it being taken place. One of my main quarrels with this legislation is that prior to this being suggested was that there was no accountability at all. That here was an agency going to have the power of several departments, going to be spending or authorizing the expenditure of billions of dollars, and responsible to nobody, not required to give an account to anybody. Now, I supported the idea of having a committee of the House. Certainly it's better than nothing, but it's a committee that deals with the matter after the fact, not prior to policies being instituted. For instance, they will not have a budget to discuss before the budget is made up. They may be allowed to look at expenditures after they've been made. But this will not give the Parliament any power. It is a reporting agency, and it's certainly better than nothing. But let nobody think for a moment that this answers the problem of Canadian content in the pipeline. Nothing at all. Matter of Canadian content is determined by the treaty. And as a member for Yukon said this afternoon, you can't amend the treaty. And of course you can't. We could ask the government to go back and renegotiate the treaty as it did with the Columbia River Treaty. But as the treaty now stands, there's no guarantee whatsoever that Canadian content will be properly recognized. Now, it may be. I'm a born optimist. Sometimes my optimism isn't fully warranted, but I think that with the 88-cent dollar, that's going to probably help us more than any other thing that the government may do, and we may get a fair share of the business. But as my colleague, the member for Sault Ste. Marie, pointed out this afternoon, we should not forget that the Alyeska line was built entirely with Japanese pipe. And we should not forget that the Americans have a DISC program, and that the West German bankers have announced that they're prepared to help finance any pipeline companies without interest during the construction period. We should not forget those things. Now, the member for Yukon again said, of course, that my colleague, the member for Sault Ste. Marie, was being hypocritical when he talked about that GATT, what GATT would do. As a matter of fact, and he said it's not a matter of whether you want GATT or not, GATT's a fact. But I point out that in the committee, the minister and the law office of the Crown were telling us that GATT didn't really matter. Because in interpreting Article 7, you must look at the preamble of the treaty, under which the interests of both countries were to be advanced. So that GATT isn't anything they can hide behind. The fact is, Mr. Speaker, that it would have been comparatively simple to have said to the Americans, you want a land bridge across our country. It's going to cause us a great deal of inconvenience. It's going to impose some hardship upon our people. But it will create jobs. And we want those jobs. And part of the quid pro quo is that we get the preference. And we could have safeguarded the company. We could have said Canadian contractors will be the first to bid. And if they can convince the minister, in charge of the monitoring agency and the officers of the monitoring agency that those bids are out of line, then those bids could be swept aside and the whole project could be laid open to competitive bidding. But Canadian contractors should have had the first right to bid. Almost every provincial government in this country, with reference to highway contracts and public works contracts, gives its own employers and its own workers a preference. And there's no reason at all why the Canadian government couldn't have done the same. It has no power under the bill except the power that's in Article 7 of the agreement. And if the minister tries to set aside Article 7 of the agreement, he'll be in real trouble with the United States. Now, the thing I want to do in closing is to point out to the House that since we started to discuss this legislation, the whole scenario has been changed. Originally, we talked about a pipeline to take Prudhoe Bay gas to the United States. But since that time, John G. McMillan, the chief executive officer of Northern Energy Company, who is a partner of Foothills, has just signed an agreement with the Pan-Alberta Gas Company for 1.04 billion cubic feet of gas per day. That works out at something over 370 billion cubic feet of gas per year. That would mean an increase of 37% in our exports of gas. Now, Mr. Speaker, of course I know the answer will be, well, you can't do this without the National Energy Board's approval. I say that they'll get that approval. I predict even more that they'll get the approval for more gas than is now being requested. And it makes one ask something. Is this government like the Bourbons who learn nothing and forget nothing?
The Boers.
Have we forgotten that it's only 5 years ago that some of us were pleading in this House to phase out the export of oil? And that today we are now a net importer of oil? And that we're being told by National Energy Board people that in the 1990s we'll be spending $4 or $5 billion a year to pay for imports of oil? Now we're going to make the same mistake with reference to gas? We're exporting now 60% of our gas production. We're going to increase it now by almost 40%. They say, but just a moment. We're going to work out a swap arrangement. Now, I think a swap arrangement could be worked out. If that swap arrangement were on an energy equivalent, so that for every 100 units of BTU energy we sold, we would get back a similar amount if and when we wanted it. And that was what the Minister of Energy, Mines and Resources talked about a few months ago. The tune has now changed. When Mr. Bob Blair, the president of Foothills, was before the committee, I asked him, what about the swap? He said, yes, we'd like to do that. On what basis? Well, he said the only basis would be that we would sell Alberta gas down this pipeline to the United States, and if and when we needed gas, we would get it back. But we would sell it at the going price now, and we would buy it at the going price then. I'm not saying the government's going to approve that, but I tried to get Mr. Stabik, the chairman of the National Energy Board, when he was before the committee, to be very specific, and he ducked right around the question. And certainly the Deputy Prime Minister wasn't any more helpful.
What's the cost of that?
Mr. Speaker, do we realize what we're doing? We are walking blindfold into a continental energy policy. The Americans have always wanted a continental energy policy, particularly when they got short of energy. They're like a couple of brothers who's gone off to town, and one saves his money and does very well, and the other one has a high old time until he's broke, and then says, "Now let's pool our resources." Well, that's exactly what the United States has been saying. Let's pool our resources. We have supplies of gas. We can manage for quite a few years. But we haven't got inexhaustible supplies. And if we enter into a swap arrangement by which we sell some 370 billion cubic feet of gas per year at, say, $2.16 at the border, and 10 or 15 years down the road we buy it back at $3.50 or $4 per thousand cubic feet, we have sold the Canadian people down the river.
Here, here.
This House better be aware of the way in which the pieces are falling together. Now they're talking about starting the pipeline, not up in the Yukon, but starting at the south end. And building the pipeline so that it will take Alberta gas down to the United States. The companies involved will make enough money out of that to begin to finance the rest of the pipeline. So that the primary purpose in the immediate future is not to take Prudhoe Bay gas to the United States. The primary purpose is to take Alberta gas to the United States. And then hope that someday, when the line is completed and Prudhoe Bay gas is coming down, if we need it, we can buy it back at a price. And that price, I suggest, Mr. Speaker, with great conviction, will not be the same price that we got for the gas which we sold. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I come to the last of my parliamentary life, I hate to be making such a pessimistic speech, but I suggest, Mr. Speaker, to the members of this House that my pessimism regarding this piece of legislation is based on some very bitter experience. I was in this House when in 1962 we debated the Columbia River Treaty proposed by the government of the Right Honourable Member for Prince Albert. And again in 1963 when we debated the amended version of it as introduced by the government of the late Lester B. Pearson. And there were only a few of us who fought that legislation. We were branded as holding up a necessary project. It was said that this was an opportunity to get the people of British Columbia very cheap gas, almost free gas, for very little inconvenience. And the legislation, of course, was put through, although we held it up for some months in the House and in committee. And were chastised in many parts of British Columbia for so doing. Mr. Speaker, today it is acknowledged by the government of British Columbia, headed by the son of the man who was Premier when the agreement was signed, that the Columbia River Treaty Agreement has cost British Columbia over $500 million. We are much wiser now than we were then about the Columbia River Treaty. Mr. Speaker, I remember 1965 when the government of the late Lester B. Pearson brought in the Canada-United States Auto Pact. And the same story was told then. This was going to give us more work. This would give us a larger share of the automobile manufacturing industry. And this was going to remove the differential in price between cars in the United States and cars in Canada. What has happened? Again, we opposed that legislation, not because we were against the principle, but because said this legislation has all the cards stacked against Canada. We're shooting craps with loaded dice. But it was rammed through amid the cheers and the hurrahs those who favored it, and the jeers to those who dared to question it. What has happened? In 12 years, we've had a slight surplus in 3 years, and in 9 of the years, we've lost about $1 billion a year on that agreement. Now, surely we ought to have learned something. And I should say, Mr. Speaker, to you that I hope that I'm wrong this time. I hope that this legislation will be beneficial. I hope that the pipeline will go well. I hope that the agreements that haven't been signed with the company and with the provinces and the territorial council and with the native Indians, that those agreements will be the kind of agreements that will protect the Canadian people. I hope the government will be able to work out ways by which even and get around Article 7 so that the Canadian content will give us the jobs that we hope. I hope that will come. But I say, Mr. Speaker, that I'm very doubtful. And the members of this House should realize now that if the things that could happen do happen, they should never claim that they weren't warned.
Here.